Here follows an extract from my book Artful Designs, available from Amazon. Chapter 13, Part 2. The first port of call for Maddox was a trip to the hospital to see if Finn's testimony might be anywhere on the horizon. His return to consciousness could provide a massive shortcut to some vital evidence. It was to be hoped that a severe bashing had knocked some sense into him. Although he might be in pretty deep trouble, it was nothing compared to murder. Cooperation in giving the key to a murder inquiry would go a long way in alleviating punishment for his presumed part in the Constable theft. As Maddox walked along the hospital corridor, it was evident that the constable on duty was just recovering his composure. There had obviously been a recent disturbance of that long, unnatural peace that encompassed the patient. "What's going on?" asked Maddox. "Is everything all right?" The lad came round for a brief minute or two, but he's sedated again and settled now. He went utterly crackers. Just as Maddox was about to ask for particular details, Scott came out of Finn's room looking terrified to the core. Not wishing to risk missing any small detail, Maddox told Scott to wait for him and to not leave his sight. He then returned his attention to the constable. "Did he say anything? Did you get a word out of him?" Maddox said. "I heard him suddenly yell, just out of the blue. When I got into the room, he was sitting bolt upright and yelling incoherently. He calmed down a bit when he saw Scott sitting there and kept grasping at him. He started mumbling something about Theo, whoever that is, and then he got all agitated again and started begging Scott to help him." Maddox was quick to deal with the situation. "Sit down right now. Write down absolutely everything that happened and everything you heard, even if you think it makes no sense at all. Did you or Scott ask him any questions?" Scott asked him what he meant when he begged for help. But by this time he was going all crazy again. The nurse had come into the room at this point and strictly forbade us to question him. She then gave him an injection and he was soon out of it all again. "Write it down while it's still fresh in your mind. I'll come back to you in a bit after I've had a chat with Scott." Maddox then turned to Scott. "You look like you've had a bit of a shock. Let's go and get a cup of tea. I don't suppose they do all those fancy coffees in the hospital canteen, but a tea bag's a tea bag wherever you go. No doubt it'll cost a small fortune, but I'll put it in my report as expenses. I'd say that this was an emergency." In the canteen, Scott sipped his tea and his ruffled feathers gradually began to settle. "I'd been sitting there all morning. Theo doesn't seem to mind and things are still a bit unsettled at the museum," Scott said. "I'd been wittering away about anything and everything. I think I'd been talking about my mum. She made this really nice tea loaf with some Tippy Assam tea from a recipe that your mum gave her. I tried to keep away from the topic of art and the museum, but it's hard to keep rambling on. I forgot where my train of thought was leading, and I said that I'd taken some into work and how much everybody had liked it. My mum was really chuffed about that." For a moment, Finn opened his eyes and mumbled quietly, Scott said. Then, all of a sudden, he sat up and got more and more upset. Before I knew what was going on, he was raving mad. He looked absolutely petrified. He then looked at me and seemed to recognise me. He calmed down for a minute, then, but not for long. He started grabbing hold of me and begging me to help him. Then the nurse shooed me away and took over. She must have given him something because he just sank back in his bed again and was fast asleep or unconscious, whatever he is now. "Did you notice him roused before you mentioned the museum?" asked Maddox. "No, he was completely out of it until I forgot what I was saying and slipped. It's all my fault again, isn't it? No matter how much I try and do the right thing, it always winds up causing trouble. I thought I was being a good friend, sitting there gabbling on. The nurses said it's good and can sometimes bring them back. They said it'd help Finn to hear a friendly voice and that people who are unconscious can often hear everything that's going on around them. Some people have remembered everything when they've come round. I've gone and messed that up too. He's in a worse state now than he was before. It'd have been better for him if he'd been left in some peace and quiet." "Nonsense, don't be so pessimistic," said Maddox. "You want him to wake up, don't you?" When he did come round, he was bound to be in a bit of a state because he took a real pasting, but that wasn't your fault, was it? Not unless you put him in the rubbish skip. Scott jumped at the suggestion. Of course I didn't. How can you even say so? There you are then. If you didn't beat up your old chum, and I'm sure you didn't, how can you be responsible for his state of mind now? We want him to wake up and come to his senses, even if it is a bit traumatic for him. Then he can help us sort out all of this mess. This seemed to reassure Scott, and he relaxed a little. You'll see I'm right, continued Maddox. Now, do me a favour. Find somewhere quiet and write everything that happened down. And I mean absolutely everything. Go home if you want. You can say I told you to. Don't leave out the tiniest detail, even if it's utter nonsense. We can't know what's important and what isn't at this stage, so it's better to have too much information than too little. Now, you get off and do that, because I need all of my courage to face up to the ward sister and ask to take the nurse off the ward for a bit, to get her side of the story. Good luck to you, laughed Scott, but with a little sign of jollity. You're a braver man than I am if you dare try that. She's an absolute battle-axe. With such gloomy portents, Scott went to gather his thoughts and left Maddox to his doom. For the full book of Artful Designs, available in paperback or as an ebook, follow the link in the cards in the description box or find details on my website at sharonbill.com. Thanks for listening.